Hi everybody, so this video is going to cover the third chapter of the book, which is going to focus on ethical development and show an approach to how we can create ethical war fighters and ethical units. One of the challenges I've found in teaching this topic is that people often push back on just the premise that you can shape people's behavior. Some of the arguments that I've heard in the past is that ultimately it can't be done, that you can't create ethical organizations. People don't have enough time to invest in shaping behavior. And I will say fundamentally this has to be rejected. Anytime we hear the concept that you can't shape people's behavior, you can't make them ethical, every leader has a responsibility to stand up and say that that is fundamentally wrong. So here we're going to just talk real quickly about the concept of organizational behavior. And this is the definition that we're providing in the book, that it's defined as the study of human behavior in organizations and settings, the interface between human behavior and the organization and within the organization itself. A subset of organizational behavior is organizational culture, and encompasses the values and behaviors of people within an organization that becomes a communal type of culture that's adopted to anybody who's part of the team. And ultimately there are two types of organizational culture. There's weak culture, where there's a disparity between people's actions and the values of the institution. And then there's strong culture, basically people adopting the values of the organization. So depicted graphically, this is what weak culture looks like. There's too much of a divide between what the people are doing and what the organization is all about. And we need to understand how that happens. Well, it occurs for a few reasons. There's a lack of organizational purpose. There's a lack of clear values. We're too ambiguous. That there's no reinforcement of the values. They may be clearly stated, but they're not really advocated for in day-to-day operations. There's no feedback mechanism on a person's adherence to their values. So I might be adhering to the values you have or not, but there's no feedback loop for me to know if I'm acting in accordance with those values and if that is actually helpful. And ultimately, the individual has no association with the organization, really. Even if the values are very clearly defined and they are truly emphasized, if an individual doesn't feel like they're a part of that team, then that team's values really don't matter. So it's critical that we link the individual to the organization. But when we do these things, there's too much of a divide there. That causes people to be unethical. They fail to adopt our values. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is take the individual's values and have them internalize the organization's, so that the organization's values are now mine. How do we achieve that? We basically do the opposite of weak culture. I know what the organization's purpose is. I know what the organization's values are. There's consistent reinforcement of those values daily, weekly, monthly. And there's feedback mechanisms that let me know if I'm adhering to the actions, if my actions are adhering to the organization's values. And ultimately, I feel like I'm a part of this team, and therefore that will motivate me to adhere to adopt the values of the organization and have my actions adhere to those values. Ultimately, it's all about command climate. And when we do that, we create this thing called an ethical mindset. Here it's defined as the instinctive thought process developed over time through critical thinking that guides a person to act in accordance with their values. Ultimately, the ethical mindset creates the moral lens through which we see the world. And that has to happen from the reflection on our values. So again, starting with values and reflecting, we create a moral lens, and that the values have to align, the individual's values have to align with the organization's, and that the moral lens never turns off. It has to be consistent and persistent. And so with our understanding of strong culture and how that's useful to us in a warfighting organization, my recommendation is that we all as a service and as a force adopt this philosophy of function ethics, which is a philosophy of how we use ethics as a function in war. Function ethics is defined here as a warfighting philosophy that seeks to shape human behavior through a clearly defined purpose that is fulfilled by values and gives meaning to the individual's actions by fostering will, resolve, and resilience, regardless of physical, mental, and moral challenges posed by the enemy or the environment. So regardless of what's happening to us, that we have a strong adherence to the organization's values. And that strong adherence is created by linking the individual serviceman or woman to an organization that has a clearly defined and meaningful purpose, and that ultimately the organization's values are critical to the success of the organization. So a graphic depiction of what function ethics would look like, it starts with the organization, whatever it may be, regardless of service, and a clear articulation of what the purpose is for that organization. And we have to have that clearly defined, and we have to be able to link the organization to that purpose. And once we're able to link the organization to that purpose, the next step is to identify the individual service member, in this case a Marine, and link the individual to the organization. The organization has a responsibility then to say very clearly, if I am going to fulfill this purpose, I need men and women who can adhere to very clearly defined values. And that's ultimately going to pull the Marine, soldier, sailor, airman into the organization only if they adhere to the values of the organization. And if they do adhere to those values, they need to be told that they're creating an impact and that their adherence to those values makes them ethical, and that being ethical is absolutely being constructive and helping us get after the purpose of the organization. Oftentimes this issue is neglected in training and in education, but as was stated before, there are people who have roadblocks that they have to get through when it comes to talking about this. We talked about the fact that it's hard to quantify these intangible things. Some people don't know how to do this. I don't know a lot of institutions in P&E that talk about organizational behavior theory or organizational culture per se. There are some people, again, going back to the first portion of this presentation, that say it can't be done. That's wrong, and we need to make sure that we squash that argument. Now that we have an understanding of organizational behavior and organizational culture, the next step is to understand ethical education, which is an academic endeavor that's designed to instill knowledge about what ethics are, what values and morals are, but also about what the values of the organization, the purpose of the organization is, etc. And in this continuum to cohesion that we covered in the previous videos, that on the left portion of this, when we talk values, the need to reflect and having a moral lens, that portion is really where we emphasize the education. And when we do talk about education, it's useful to provide a taxonomy that helps us understand how adults can learn. So here we see Bloom's taxonomy, which helps provide a model to understand adult education, and that at its very foundational levels of knowledge and comprehension, that ethical education to create ethical men and women in the service has to basically provide baseline knowledge, and we need to ensure that our men and women can comprehend that. Everyone in your unit, if we want them to be ethical, should be able to define what ethics is, what values are, and what are the values of their organization. They need to be armed with the knowledge of what an ethical dilemma is. They need to understand what ethical relativism is. So the first step of creating a strong culture is starting with ethical education. So when it comes to the topic of ethical education, we should educate people on some of the following things. What is the purpose of your organization? What is the individual's responsibility to the organization? How are they important? How is the individual helping us fulfill the purpose of the organization? Do our people know about critical thinking? Do they know about the logical traps that will keep them from understanding what values are important and why they help us become successful? We need to define what ethics are for our people. They need to understand those things. We also need to educate them on the things that will challenge us when it comes to the topic of becoming ethical. To quote Dave Grossman, author of the book On Killing and on Combat, forewarned is forearmed. So people anticipating the challenges that could cause them to slide down Maslow's hierarchy of needs helps them understand that they can push back on that and not fall into the trappings of moral culmination too easily. And we ultimately need to also educate our people on doctrine as well. I find that the more people understand what war is, its importance and significance, that all the other subcomponents like planning, intelligence, leadership, fires, and now ethics become much more useful in the context of warfighting. So if we want to create an ethical mindset, ultimately we have to start with ethical education, which is very conceptual. The next step then is to get into ethical training, where we get a bit more focused and a bit more detailed. And if we understand ethical education here, being on the left side of this continuum to cohesion, that training, ethical training, really takes into account action and ethical application of our values. Here, ethical training is defined as the application of knowledge received in ethical education. Far too often we spend too much time talking about values, but we don't spend enough time trying to get people to apply them, even in training scenarios like martial arts, hand-to-hand combat training. That is a fundamentally valuable platform to use to get people to apply values under duress. Going back to Bloom's taxonomy, if we started with knowledge and then comprehension as the foundational aspects of ethical education in this taxonomy to become somebody who can synthesize action that's ethical, that the next two steps of application and analysis is where ethical training comes into play. So can people apply the knowledge that they've had on ethics when it comes to leading teams both in garrison and deployed? That ultimately we get a little more focused on ethical training when we talk about things like stress inoculation, martial arts training, conducting ethical tactical decision exercises, as well as games, but decision exercises, and just giving tests and exams when you do uniform inspections, asking people basic questions about this topic can help reinforce and train our Marines to have a better understanding of not just what ethics is, but how we can apply it. And what we do when we conduct ethical training is we're training our people to understand that in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when we think we would be getting deprived of some of these things, that ultimately we're not. That ethical training can demand of servicemen and women to adhere to their values, even when they would normally have thought that physiological needs aren't being met or when their safety is not being met. So when, again, going back to hand-to-hand combat training, when somebody is getting punched or kicked in a safe training environment, that they can still adhere to our values, and it builds the type of stress inoculation that lets them know that while they are being stressed and even under a certain amount of physical pain, that their physiological needs are still being met. Ultimately, we need to push back and extend our people's culminating point when it comes to being ethical. They need to be aware that they can be ethical when deprived of sleep, of comfort, of food, when they're under physical, say muscular or cardiovascular endurance, even when they're presented with violence. Our men and women need to be aware of the fact that they not only can, but must still adhere to our values. In a memo to the force, Secretary Mattis wanted to address the topic of ethical standards. In his letter on the topic of ethics, he emphasized that we need to be ethical regardless of the circumstances or whether or not anybody is watching. So whether it's in garrison or whether we're forward deployed conducting combat operations in an expeditionary environment. It would later go on to say that we must train to prepare ourselves and our subordinates, that we have a responsibility to develop the bias for action that is ethical even when we're under duress. Ultimately, leaders need to push their people beyond what they thought they were capable of doing beforehand. It's a critical component of ethical training. We do need to provide them the why behind it. There are times that our people will be pushed outside of their comfort zones and that will sometimes be an unpopular practice. That pushing people physically, mentally, and morally will sometimes foster resentment. Leaders need to have the moral courage to still drive this point home to their people. Ultimately, what we need people to do, if we want them to be ethical, is to be aware that they are far more capable than they had previously thought of, that they can thrive with very little, and that even while suffering, they can still win. So this brings us to the final portion where we talk about the subject of ethical reinforcement. And in this continuum to cohesion, we talked about the education piece, we talked about the training piece. The consistent reinforcement then goes to the right of this and ultimately helps us get to the cohesion that's central to our maneuver warfare philosophy. So the final step in this development of ethical warfighters is consistent reinforcement. And all consistent reinforcement is a daily, hourly event that occurs when we just inform people about what our values are and whether or not their actions are adhering to those values. So it's a feedback loop to our people to let them know if their conduct is good or bad, but also lets them know that they're contributing to the organization's success and fulfilling its purpose. And it consists of three things. One is approving actions, which is encouraging the right behavior. The second is disapproving actions, which is letting people know that they're not necessarily getting it done, that they didn't adhere to our values, and consequently they are compromising our ability to succeed in fulfilling the organization's purpose. And then there's inaction, which is ultimately passive approval of unethical conduct. When somebody's in a position of leadership and they see somebody doing something wrong, by not acting and not communicating that unethical conduct is bad, they're giving passive approval to that action. And ultimately that'll reinforce to their subordinates that it's okay to be unethical. And again, that creates that divide between the organization's values and the individual's values. So we talked about here in Maslow's hierarchy of needs that war can deprive us of safety and physiological needs. And we talked earlier about how a toxic command climate can keep us from feeling a sense of love and belonging or a sense of self-esteem that we're part of this great team. That's what bad leadership and bad command climates can do, but they can also create wonderful teams that will spend a tremendous amount of time, effort, and energy contributing and pulling for the success of everyone around them, because we have a shared purpose, we have a shared sense of values, and that's going to facilitate and fan the flames of the cohesion that we need as a warfighting organization. That ultimately, if we have knowledge and comprehension being ethical education, application and analysis being ethical training, that the synthesis of ethical action, the synthesis of new acts in a new scenario, and the evaluation of good and bad conduct really happens through consistent reinforcement. So here we see the three components building us up to having a greater understanding of ethics, values, and their importance to our teams as warfighting organizations. So again, focusing on that ethical mindset, we start with ethical education and the components of ethical education. Then we go from that conceptual to a more functional training-based application of those principles that we learned about from ethical education into ethical training. And then we go into something that occurs far more frequently, which is consistent reinforcement, which occurs, again, daily, even hourly, and consists of affirming actions, disapproving actions, ultimately getting us to that ethical mindset that we want all of our men and women to have. So completing this continuum to cohesion, if we have the ethical education, ethical training, and then a consistent reinforcement mechanism that fans that flame consistently and doesn't allow the values or the purpose of the organization to drift too far from their people's minds, that all of these ultimately result in creating an ethical organization, a sense of strong organizational culture. So taking what was usually a very amorphous and conceptual concept like ethics that was usually in the realm of philosophy, you could go into a much more specific realm and make it something that's actually functional and detailed. You can create a pretty good training plan off of this philosophy, which some people have in the past. Say if you were a company commander, you could say that there are 3 lines of operation that you want to have focused on throughout the year: mission prep, equipment readiness, and creating total Marines, right? Developing our people. If we do focus on a total Marine that has to operate in war that will impose physical, mental, and moral factors, then it would make sense that you're creating physically, morally, and mentally fit Marines, soldiers, sailors, or airmen. And if that is the case, you can develop over time a training plan in each one of these components of the total Marine, total soldier, sailor, airman development when they're with your organization. So here's an example of things you can do physically. Here's an example of things you can do mentally to develop your people, and then things you can do to develop your people morally. So if we focus on education, training, and then consistent reinforcement, we just use those as areas of focus throughout, months, even years. When it comes to ethical education, you can get very specific. These are the things we want our people to be educated on. These are the things we want our people to be trained on, and then have some sort of guidance on the application of consistent reinforcement. Things we absolutely want to look for and encourage, things we want to discourage as well. One is conceptual, one is functional, one is detailed, but also that one is frequent, occurs more frequently, and the other one occurs most frequently. And then what you can do with that sort of layout is then take that approach and apply it over time. These are the things we will do daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly.